Well, I think we should start, Roger, shouldn't we? It's 12 o'clock.
Yep.
Okay. Well, for those people who have joined us so far, thanks very much for this, joining us for the PARC conference. The process that we're going to adopt is that Roger's going to speak for about 25, 30 minutes. And then we're going to have some questions and discussions for a further 30 minutes. And the way that'll work is that you can either ask direct questions, or alternatively, Melissa, who's on the call, will be using the chat facility, and her task is to collate the chat lines, and at the end of that, at the end of the questioning, given to me to pass to Roger, or given to Roger directly. Personally, a bit of protocol. One of the things that we need to do is to ensure that we're on mute. So you will be on mute, which is of course no good if you want to ask a question. So you've got the facility to mute and unmute yourself on the top right hand side of the screen. So don't forget to keep on mute unless you are speaking. What else do we say? Should we say? I think we're about there, aren't we? I think anything else I've missed, Phil? Jolly good. Okay, Roger's got the slides.
I know that we are recording today's session, and Carmen will also be providing us with post-meeting notes, which will be shared shortly after today. Well said.
So recording, the session's recorded, you will get the slides afterwards, and Carmen will be supplementing those with some brief written notes as well. So jolly good. Over to you, Roger Bootle.
Well, thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to you today, although I both wish it was in happier times, and of course that we could be doing this event in the same room, but there we are. Now, obviously I'm going to be talking about the economics of this crisis and the consequences. You all know that economists often talk a lot of old nonsense, and what they have to say has to be treated with more than the usual pinch of salt. I think actually government health warning applies even more so now, so I hope you'll be tolerant of the fact that I'm going to be making some pretty speculative remarks and views about the future. It's impossible to know what's going to happen, so we have to be careful about that. Don't worry, I'm not going to stop at that. I will be saying something, and I hope at the very least that what I've got to say will serve as a framework for thinking about the key issues. Now, how am I going to divide this? First of all, I'm going to start by talking, if I can pronounce this word, about the epidemiological possibilities. Now, of course, I'm not a specialist, although it's quite interesting that the government keeps talking about they're going to be guided by the science, whatever that may mean. Well, there isn't a science or the science, and indeed it's become increasingly clear over the last few weeks that epidemiology, whatever merits it might have, bears quite a lot of similarities to economics. Physics, it ain't. Anyway, I'll say a bit about that to start with. Then I'll say something about the immediate economic outlook. Then I'll move on to how governments will deal with this enormous amount of debt that's being incurred. And lastly, I'll say something about the lasting social, business and economic effects. I should say, by the way, that most of what I've got to say is really of relevance, I think, to the whole world, because just about everywhere is affected by this. But obviously my primary focus is the UK and to a lesser extent other countries in the European Union. And I'm going to come to the question of Brexit, by the way, at the end. So let me start by saying something about the epidemiological possibilities. Now, this is blissfully simple what I've got to say here, but I think it's very, very important. I'm sure that there are other categories that you could put forward, but I think it helps to get your thinking straight to imagine three different states of the world, and they're listed here in increasing order of optimism. The first is that the virus lingers on and no reliable vaccine is developed. Now, obviously, if you believe something like that, the economic consequences are going to be devastating, they're going to be long-lived, and much of what I've got to say will not, frankly, be applicable. The second scenario is that the virus dies out, but with or without a vaccine, fears of something similar happening again linger on. And the third scenario is one in which the virus dies out and or a vaccine is developed and there are no remaining fears of something coming back again. That's the most optimistic scenario one can imagine. If you like, it takes us back to the pre-virus days. After all, we didn't walk around, did we, worrying about a resurgence of Spanish flu or the Great Plague, even though those things were in the historical record books. We simply give it a moment's thought, and it's possible the world will move to that sort of situation, in which case, of course, one can be a lot more optimistic about the economic impact. Now, my own view is that the second of these scenarios is the more likely, at least for some considerable time. We get over it, it dies out, we develop a vaccine, but things don't go completely back to normal for a very long time, simply because this has been a really scarring experience, and people are genuinely worried about something similar happening again. That is my baseline. Now let me move on to the pure economics. And here also I've got scenarios, 4 of them, in increasing orders of optimism. Now this is really a schematic way of thinking about this, so that don't pay attention to the detailed positioning of these lines on the chart. It's getting the picture of the future clear in your mind. So the red line here is a schematic representation of what the path of GDP might have been like before the virus, growing whatever its normal rate is, 1.5%, 2%. Then along comes the virus, as this is shown in the blue line, and we get this dramatic drop in GDP. And some countries it may be 25, 30%, some people have even suggested maybe 50%. And in this scenario, at some point or other, we recover from all that. We actually get back to the pre-virus level of GDP, but we never get back to the pre-existing path. And as you can see by the fact that the slope of the blue line is more shallow than the slope of the red line, not only have we suffered this one-off drop in GDP, but the growth rate of GDP is permanently lower. That is, I think, something like the most pessimistic scenario for the economy. Scenario 2 is rather different. It's the same idea about the dramatic drop you see there in the blue line, but then the economy recovers and it gets back to something like the path that it would have been on without the virus. And what's more, growth after that is the same as it was and would have been. So it's very important to get these things clear in one's mind, because a lot of people talk loosely, the use of language is very loose about these concepts. Now, I mean, if this were to turn out, would we got over the virus, economic effects thereof? Well, yes, we will have done, in the sense that the slope of the red line is the same as it would have been before. But we never recoup that V shape, right? It's a dead weight loss. We never, in this scenario, recover it. It's lost for all time. And that V shape gives us the extent of the economic losses from the virus. This, by the way, is something like the scenario that I believe is most likely. Now, moving again up the optimism scale, scenario 3 is this. Not only do we actually get back to the red line, the pre-virus path of GDP, but there's such a boom, a recovery boom afterwards, that we actually enjoy a period of extra rapid growth, which makes up for the loss that we've suffered during the virus itself. So the idea is that that blue triangle, the inverted V above the line there, should be exactly the same size as the downward, the normal V below the line. Now, if this scenario were to turn out, then there will be no lasting loss from the virus at all, economic. Some people believe this, I personally don't. I think this would be pretty optimistic. There is actually an even more optimistic scenario, scenario 4, where not only do we have this burst of growth that makes up for the loss of GDP in the down phase, but as you can see, once we're back to normal, economic growth is actually faster than it would have been without the virus. Incredible, isn't it? But actually some people do believe this. There are a number of ways in which this might happen. I think probably the most likely, the most believed, for those who do believe these things, is that from an economic point of view, the virus has a sort of cleansing effect on the economy. It knocks out all sorts of inefficient ideas, inefficient firms, which are zombies anyway, and the economy thereafter is healthier. This is known, not in relation to the virus particularly, but more generally, as often an Austrian view, because it's a view of the economy. Periodically, it needs these serious downturns to cleanse the system. It was put forward by a number of Austrian economists in the past. Interestingly, it was the governor of the Austrian Central Bank who recently espoused this in relation to the Eurozone. And he said something like, all economies need a good cleansing every so often. I don't know what his career prospects are like now after those remarks. I mean, some people do believe something like this. I personally don't. It would be wonderful if it were true that our growth path would be higher after the virus, but I don't believe it. So scenario 2, I wonder if I could just quickly go back to illustrate that for you, to remind you. This is the sort of thing that I have in mind, that there's permanent long-term damage in certain sectors, which would otherwise result in lower growth, scenario 1. But there are other benefits, maybe a bit of cleansing, different policies, which enable the pre-virus growth path of the economy to return. We never recover the loss of output in the downturn. That's the sort of view that I take, but even that you might say is relatively optimistic. Just to remind you, scenario 1, quite a lot of people think this is what we're in for. And not only do we never recover that down with that V, but also we're on a permanently lower growth path. Right, well, I hope that helps to clarify your thinking. How rapid will the recovery be once it comes? Of course, no one knows, and there's a game of people keep talking about the letters. You know, is it a V, is it a W, a U, an L, or whatever? No one knows. I think there are a couple of things that one can say, however, about this. In my view, a very rapid recovery is not likely, and we can see this, the evidence for it anyway, in the behavior of people in countries that have already started to relax. It's quite clear that people and businesses are very cautious. And my guess is they're going to remain cautious. So yes, the recovery will begin, it will continue, but I don't see immediately people rushing out to go back to where they were before. There's a possibility, of course, well, a likelihood that in some sectors, supply capacity will have been seriously damaged. That's true in the hospitality business, about which more in a moment. It's true probably in the airline business, a number of others, and that's going to inhibit the extent to which the economy can recover. Now, there are some factors pointing the opposite direction. Pent-up demand. I mean, at some point or other, when confidence returns, you've got to imagine that people are going to exercise their frustration in not having been out to the pub, restaurants, foreign travel, and so on, and want to indulge all that. I think that's right, although I suspect tempered by continued considerable caution. We do have a bit of evidence to go on here, and I'm afraid it's a bit contradictory. This is the evidence from China over the SARS, I think we call it an epidemic, 2003. And there are 2 lines here, and I may briefly explain them. The red line shows the official Chinese GDP. This is quarterly changes. And as you can see, if you look at the official Chinese figures over that period, it's very difficult to see anything at all of any significance, actually. Mind you, as I frequently say, if I were you, I wouldn't believe much of data that comes out of China, official data on GDP, or much else. And we at Capital Economics don't. We construct our own series of China activity proxy indicator, shown here as the blue line. And you can see what happened, according to our indicator, of economic activity then. There was a dramatic drop into negative territory, followed by a pretty much equal and offsetting bounce back. So this was a case where, in that instance, probably this was pretty much like scenario 3, I guess, that I showed earlier on. Pretty optimistic picture. We've also got some evidence as to what's happening in China now. Of course, the GDP figures themselves are lacking, aren't much help, and I've already said that I think they can be very unreliable. But at Capital Economics, we track a whole load of micro data. And here I show you some, and these are pretty up to date. These are only, I think, about 3 days old, this information. We track it daily. Subway passenger numbers, long distance travel, property sales, coal consumption. And you can see that there has been a pretty substantial recovery, not as rapid as the downturn in February, and it hasn't yet come back to normal. And some indicators like long-term travel are still running at less than 50% of the pre-virus level. So that gives you some background as to what to expect. My own guess is that the recovery phase is probably going to last something like 2 years, maybe 3 years, followed by what I hope will be something like a return to normal growth. Now, let me move on to my second topic, which is debt. And this may sound a bit geeky, but I think it's important. I know from my column in the Daily Telegraph, I get quite a substantial e-bag of readers writing in. I know people are very, very concerned about the implications of government debt, and this is not just the sort of usual disgusteds from Tunbridge Wells who write in to the Telegraph. The whole load of people are worried about it. I think they're right to be worried about it. And the general view is, look, the government's been good and imaginative in dealing with this crisis. It's been generous, that's the right thing to do, but how on earth are we going to pay for it? We're going to be saddled with enormous debt. And essentially, there are 4 ways to deal with huge levels of government debt. The first is to put up with it, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Second is austerity, that's to say to cut government spending and raise taxes in order to turn the deficit into a surplus and gradually pay down the debt. The third is simply not pay it, default, say, well, hard luck, okay, we owe that money to you, we're not paying it, not paying the interest and not paying the capital. And the last is inflation, just let inflation rip and therefore reduce the real value of the debt. And I want to say a bit about the consequences of these and what I think is likely to happen. Obviously, this is going to be of enormous importance to all of us as individuals, but also to all our businesses, which of these the government in the end ends up taking. Tolerance is, I think, the preferred way, and I'm going to show you a bit of evidence on that in a moment. Economic growth is the key. As long as you've got sustained economic growth, you can grow your way out of enormous levels of public debt. Now, if you're clobbered with a situation in which you've got those enormous levels of government debt, and for one reason or another, there is very little economic growth, then you really are up a gum tree. Then you've got to start thinking about other things. Even with economic growth, however, decent rates of economic growth, you may need to make use of what we economists call financial repression. That's to say, you manage and squeeze and intervene in the financial system so as to minimize the costs of the government servicing this huge level of debt. And that may involve, usually does involve, maintaining very, very low interest rates below the rate of inflation. Now, I don't know how this sounds to you, this idea of tolerating it, so not squeezing everything, not raising taxes, not defaulting and not allowing inflation. It may sound fantastical to you, but the fact of the matter is we've done it twice before. This shows the historical record going back to 1700 of the ratio of government debt to GDP in the UK. And you can see 2 large spikes. The first one is at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, when the debt to GDP ratio got to about 200%. And the second is just after the Second World War, where it exceeded 250%. And we've been getting worried about Italy until recently, the 120, 130. And now Italy's going to be 160, 170, 180, more about that in a moment. And in the UK, we're talking about passing 100, and some people think it'll be 120, 130%. I think they're right, by the way. It could go higher. So we've done it in the past, twice. And how did we do it? Slight differences in these 2 periods. In the 19th century, it was sustained economic growth. There was a bit of austerity. We ran surpluses on the budget pretty much throughout the 19th century. It wasn't inflation, interestingly. I mean, on average, there was no inflation over the 19th century. The price level went up and down and averaged about 0. After the Second World War, again, it was sustained economic growth. The difference is there wasn't so much austerity. We were careful with the budget. There was budgetary discipline on average. But the difference in the 19th century is there was sustained inflation. Although up to the 1970s, it wasn't that fast. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it wasn't that bad. But a combination of inflation, financial repression, sustained economic growth got the thing down. And that's, I think, the historical experience we ought to be aiming to emulate again now. It's relatively painless. Austerity, that's to say cutting spending and raising taxes. There'll be a lot of people calling for this, and indeed, to some extent, we could be driven into it. But not, I think, the best way to go. For a start, it can be self-defeating. You've got an economy which has got its problems anyway. Along comes the government, slashes government spending and raises taxes. Not exactly, I think, a good way forward. It can be self-defeating politically, distinctly unappealing. If this is going to be the fate of the Johnson government, gosh, there's going to be considerable disappointment. If you have to go down this route, and to some extent we may have to, I think spending restraint is far preferable to tax rises, because to go back to what I said about economic growth, you want all the incentives and the efficiency of the economic system to be operating at absolute maximum. If you have to be restrained in some sense or other, it's your pet projects on which you have spending projects on which you have to be restrained. Now, various people have said that inflation is, well, some people have said it's inevitable. Quite a few commentators have recently said it's desirable. I think they're wrong on both counts. Inevitable is a big word. I don't like to use very often. It's not inevitable. We had a bit of it after the Second World War, but not masses. We had none of it in the 19th century. There are ways of operating this so that we do not end up with an inflationary splurge. I think the key thing to emphasize is it's not the right way to go. It's not a victimless policy. The people suggest that, you know, you just inflate everything away and no one loses. Of course people lose. There are a whole load of people who lose their real wealth because the real value of their wealth is eaten away by inflation. Inflation up rather than gone to a default here. Let me just carry on talking about inflation. I'll go back to default. The pain is distributed unfairly, and I think perhaps most damaging about inflation, it's very difficult and costly to squeeze it out of the system. We had inflation in the 1970s, and in the 80s it was squeezed out. Very high inflation, high interest rates, high unemployment, very painful. So I don't think it is a good idea to adopt inflation as a policy. It might happen by accident. Now, to go back to default, what about that? This isn't a free option either. The government says, I'm not going to pay you what we owe you, then someone's going to lose out. Now, it's fine up to a point if that someone is a foreigner, but well, fine for you, not for them, of course, but that's not a luxury allowed to very many countries. When default happens, and of course lots of governments have defaulted, in the case of Greece and Argentina umpteen times, then there are people in the domestic economy who lose out, and those people may include domestic financial institutions, including banks, insurance companies, and so on, so forth, pension funds, which are vital to the financial system. So, you know, that potentially can be extremely damaging. Now, the UK in modern times has never defaulted. Go back, you know, hundreds of years, and there are various kings who didn't pay their debts, but in modern times the UK has never defaulted, and this has served us well. It wouldn't be a good time to start. So I rule that out. I rule out default, I rule out inflation, and I think as far as possible we should avoid austerity. It's growth and tolerance with a bit of financial repression that we should go for. Now, I said I'd say something about other countries briefly. I think that's what we should go for, and we've got the luxury, and so has the United States, of going down that route. I think there's a good chance we will get growth up to reasonable levels. And to start with, the debt ratio will not be astronomical. The same could not be said of Italy. It starts off with a much higher ratio of government debt to GDP. It's had next to no growth since the euro was formed more than 20 years ago. Its institutions are in a terrible state. It doesn't issue its own currency. It can't borrow in a currency that it issues, which is what the position is for the Bank of England. You know, the government issues all this debt, Bank of England buys it, all very well. In the case of Italy, it borrows in a currency that someone else issues, that's to say, the euro issued by the ECB. This, I think, re-emphasizes how fragile the whole euro system is. And I personally think, I thought it for some time, the euro has been an accident waiting to happen. And I think this is it. And once we've got over the virus, pray God as soon as possible, including Italy, then I'm afraid I think it's in a very, very difficult position, Italy, and there's a very good chance that it will leave the euro. I don't see it's got much way out. And that's then going to pose a significant problem for the EU as a whole. Not optimistic about that surviving either. I'll say a bit more about Brexit in a moment. Now I wanted to move on to the last topic I said I would touch on. That's to say a few speculative remarks about what the post-COVID economy will look like. What changes should we think there might be? Now, first of all, the work environment. Are we going to enjoy or at least undergo a marked change to the work environment. And there are differing views on this, aren't there? I mean, some people think that having had the experience we've had, after all, here we are now having a virtual conference, and it seems, as far as I can tell, to be working pretty well. In my own firm, Capital Economics, we're continuing absolutely as before. In fact, our output rate has gone up because of what we produce is virtual. Businesses carry on absolutely normally, and there are a lot of other businesses for which that is true. Now, of course, for quite a few businesses, it's not true. But for those of it which it is true, the question is, why go back to the old status quo with normal office life? Now, others say to me, do you know, at Capital Economics, they say, okay, it's great, it can function, but boy, do we miss the office. We miss people, we miss the camaraderie. It's not the same. So between those two extremes, what's likely to happen? Well, I think there is going to be rather more home working. It's not, I think, going to go to the extreme where we abandon offices altogether. But I think there was a distinct tendency in this direction anyway. And I've thought for some time, in my latest book called The AI Economy, I speculate about what the implications of the increasing use of artificial intelligence and robots will be for general prosperity and working habits. And I was of the view then that we would gradually be moving towards a 4-day working week, and I hold to that. Now, if on top of that, we've also got the realization that quite a lot of office jobs can be done successfully from home, I wonder whether one of those 4 days, initially, of course, now a 5-day week, might actually be done from home. So I see a sort of in-between solution in which quite a lot of people do work more from home, at least some of the time. Now, this, of course, has potentially big impacts on the commercial property market. It depends, though, on how offices are arranged. I mean, if the whole place goes virtual, which arguably Capital Economics could do, then we could abandon our offices altogether and organize socializing events, not in an office, a pub or a restaurant or whatever, some meeting place every so often to give the camaraderie and the connection. But if what's happening is people are just taking 1 day a week working from home, of course, but they're still going back to their desk, which is recognizably theirs, is in a designated office space, then that would have no impact on the demand for commercial property. It pays your money and takes your choice. I think there will be actually some diminution over the years in the demand for commercial office space. I'm more confident about business travel. I think we will find a lot of businesses deciding that they can now economize on their business travel, do a lot less of it, and gain as a result. And in general, I think one of the implications of this is going to be, in many ways, unfortunately, for employment levels, more use of artificial intelligence and robots if possible. I'm going to race through some of these ideas. Consumer spending, just a few snippets. Not rocket science, this. I think hospitality spend in all its manifestations is going to be on the back foot for some considerable time. It's going to be the last part of the economy to return to normal. Obviously, there's going to be more use of online shopping. Now, this is, I think, an interesting speculative idea. I wouldn't be surprised if one of the implications of all this is people are going to spend a lot more money on home improvements. If, after all, the view of the future is going to be that not only are they going to spend more time at home on leisure things, but actually more of their working time at home, then that really puts a premium on having the layout of their homes conducive to that. Lastly, might there be higher saving? I suspect that there will be. I think there'll be a mood of caution among consumers for some time, and that it'll be difficult to get them to spend openly and generously. Globalisation. On the retreat, yes, I think. It was, I suspect, in that direction, heading that way anyway before the virus. We're going to see a big change in the political position of China. Could be a lot worse than that, I think. But I'm very worried about the relationship between America and China, where it might lead. I think in all our businesses and as individuals, we're going to put more weight, aren't we, on security of supply over price. Obviously, we're still going to be concerned about price, but we've learned that security of supply really, really counts. I think there's going to be a move towards reshoring, which was underway anyway, helped by technology. On a different note, something again that concerns me, if you like, the political economy of all this. What's it going to do to our views about government and the role of the state versus the individual? Well, it's quite clear there's going to be more spending on health in this country, a lot more spending on the NHS. And from my point of view, I'm slightly concerned that it's going to be even more difficult to get reform of the NHS. Nigel Lawson said many years ago that the NHS is the closest British, or did he say the English, come to a national religion, and I think he's right about that. And that religion has received, I think, a lot of reaffirmation recently. It's going to have a lot more spending there. But also, after all, this is a public crisis. It's a public health crisis. Public health is a public good. And so one of the things to come out of this, I think, is to re-emphasize the public, the community, the state over the individual. And I'm slightly concerned that this is going to develop into a sort of an anti-capitalist mood, with public opinion moving against high earners, in favor of high taxes, especially on the wealthy, less tolerance for high executive pay, and less tolerance for dividends. I'm concerned about that. Now, lastly, quickly, a word or two about the virus and Brexit rears its ugly head again. I know there are umpteen different views about Brexit, and I respect those. There is a view doing the rounds that the devastation caused by the virus means that it's even more important than usual that we don't go ahead with fully leaving the EU at the end of this year, and we extend the transition period. The British government has said it's not going to. It's even said that if the EU offers that, the British government will say no. Again, a lot of people think this is just posturing. Let me say a few words quickly about the two important propositions from you as businesses, from your point of view. First of all, are they right? Are we likely to leave at the end of this year without extending the transition period? And secondly, is that the right thing to do? Answer, I think we are likely to leave at the end of this year without extending the transition period. I don't think the government is bluffing. And that's for the same reasons as answer the second question. I think, for a start, the damage done by leaving the end of this year without extending the transition period is much exaggerated, and compared to the damage done by the coronavirus, frankly, it's peanuts. It's a different order of magnitude. Indeed, there are some advantages from the coronavirus crisis because trade volumes will be much lower. So when we leave, if we leave without a deal, all the usual stuff about lorry park queues and difficulties of getting to customers will be much less serious than they would otherwise have been. But my key argument is, if we stayed in the EU, or stayed effectively in the EU by extending the transition period, we would find ourselves in a really, really difficult position where we were in the EU effectively with no vote and no influence over what it did, at precisely a time when we need maximum flexibility over our own domestic regulations and the freedom of action of the British government. We would be in the budget negotiations, or we wouldn't be negotiating, we'd be subject to paying more money at a very dangerous time, and we'd be subject to EU rules and regulations. This is potentially extremely dangerous, and in particular with regard to the risk of the euro collapsing, the UK being called upon to contribute to the costs of bailing Italy out, and maybe the whole eurozone. So I think it's a very, very strong argument for leaving at the end of this transition period. It is indeed what I expect will happen, and I don't think the consequences will be devastating. Nothing compared to the coronavirus. I think my conclusions should be fairly clear. We briefly run over them. Most importantly, perhaps, by the time this is all over, people keep talking about how we're going to pay for the virus. We will have paid for it already in the form of lost output. What we have to make sure is we don't then make us pay for it all over again by clobbering the economy through an extended period of austerity. And I think we can do that. We can avoid doing it. And we've done it twice before. Italy cannot. I'm very worried about the Italian situation. I think the euro will crack. By contrast, I think we'll escape with little long-term damage. Don't forget those V's I showed you. Doesn't mean to say that there will have been no cost to the virus. There will have been a big cost, but we will have already paid it. I suspect the shape of spending will be very different, and I gave you some ideas as to some of the changes. I think we're likely to leave the EU fully on time at the end of this year, and that's not going to be a disaster. Perhaps lastly and speculatively, I'm worried about the political consequences of all this. I'm worried about, not just in this country, but other countries, what it's going to do to popular opinion about business versus the state. And I'm concerned that that may lead to a number of anti-business policies. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. That was giving us the answer to our current predicament in 30 minutes. That's absolutely astounding. So we'll come to some questions first. I guess there have been quite a few on the chat line, but first off, let's pick on somebody. Phil Wills, you're normally a man with a question. What's your question to Roger?
Where to start? Is there anybody else, a couple of questions, is there anybody else apart from Italy that is likely to not be able to service their debt. Any major country that comes in that category. And how do you catch the increasing cost impact of less globalization? I mean, will we be able to stand that in terms of manufacturing costs and consumer prices?
Yeah, they're both excellent questions. Well, the points I was making about Italy also apply to a number of other countries in the Eurozone. All those countries with very high debts, it applies to Greece, to Spain, to Portugal, and increasingly to France. The difference, though, and why I particularly picked out Italy, is its low growth rate. This isn't only about debt, as I indicated before. You know, if you've got a decent underlying growth rate, then you can plausibly grow your way out, although certainly not out of the woods. Greece has done a reasonable job at recovering recently. Until this ghastly virus hit, Spain was growing quite well, and some of the other countries. So they're all potentially subject to it, but Italy, I think, is the most vulnerable because of the combination of the high debt and pretty much zero growth since the euro began 20 years ago, and not much prospect of it either. I should say, of course, that there is another view of all this. I mean, I'm a Eurosceptic, as you probably know. I mean, it may well be that this is the crisis that finally brings the euro area together. This is possible. Some people have said this, you know, that finally confronted with the possibility of a euro breakup, what actually happens is that the authorities across Europe get their act together and finally come to the aid of Italy and other countries. There's a common fiscal policy and something like political union. It's possible, although I don't myself think it's likely. On globalization, well, there will be some costs. I mean, I talked about, you know, more attention to security of supply rather than price. Well, by definition, logically, that's got to mean, you know, you've got to pay something for that, and we will pay something. I don't think it's actually as gloomy as it might sound. Partly because of technology changing and making a lot of things possible that weren't possible before. And in some countries, Britain may be one of these, parts of our manufacturing sector may benefit from this because you know, we'll get some reshoring of activity which previously took place elsewhere. And I don't myself think that globalization was the great engine of prosperity over the last 20 years that some people think that it was. I mean, it brought some gains. It also brought quite a lot of redistribution within our societies. There were gainers and there were losers. And so if it goes into reverse, similarly, there'll be gainers and losers, and there'll be the opposite to the gainers and losers before. Is it a negative? Yeah, I think it is a net negative economically. But I don't myself think that's absolutely overpowering. I'm more concerned about the other points I made. You know, is there going to be a move towards austerity or default or mass inflation or debt default, all these various things? Those are, I think, the bigger risks.
Yeah, there have been quite a few questions on chat. And Sarah Hamilton-Hannah, you just had a question. What's your question?
I was just asking whether we think the UK government might review the proposed increases in minimum wage. Obviously, you know, the proposals are that minimum wage is increasing at significantly higher levels than inflation.
Yeah.
What do you think they might do about that?
Well, I certainly think they ought to. Difficult issue, this. I mean, before the crisis, the Conservative government was doing its best to portray itself as effectively very similar in many of its economic proposals to a sort of, maybe not a Corbyn Labour government, but a sort of pre-Corbyn Labour government. And I think it was doing that from the best of all possible motives. And for a time, it seemed that there wasn't a cost to pay. That it was, you could have a free lunch, as it were. You could raise the minimum wage. All sorts of people would be a lot better off. That wouldn't hit employment. It wasn't going to be very damaging to employers. And so why not do it? If that was true before, and I was always skeptical, I don't think it's true now. I think in the environment that we're moving into, it's going to be very difficult. In particular, of course, a lot of these lowly paid people who are going to be affected by this, employed by sectors that are going to be particularly hard hit, for instance, the hospitality sector. So I would hope that the government would review this. But you see, think about the politics of it. You know, all these people, you know, people unemployed, people have been made very badly off. Here's the government elected, you know, wanting to govern for the whole nation, wanting to level up and so on and so forth. And then one of the first things it does is it rows back on its plans to increase the minimum wage. not going to look good, is it? The politics are not going to look good. But I think, nevertheless, it's what it should do.
And Tom Armitage, you had a question about employment. Do you want to give us that?
Hello, it's Tom here from the Telegraph, actually. So yeah, it's great to hear your presentation. Thank you very much, Roger. Yeah, one of the questions was just around, we've got a quarter of the UK workforce now on the government payroll, and I'm just wondering what your take is in terms of what unemployment rates will look like over the short, medium, long term.
Well, I don't know how high it's going to get. I think the way to think about this is in terms of the 4 scenarios that I laid out for GDP in the crisis earlier on. I mean, employment and unemployment will follow broadly the same pattern. It's a question of how rapid and how fulsome the economic recovery is. Maybe a little bit worse than that for reasons I'll say something about in a minute. But in general, I mean, if we get this sharp recovery, albeit not very rapid, over the next 2 or 3 years, bringing us back to something like the pre-virus level of unemployment, then I'll think of GDP. Then I think we'll get back to something like the pre-virus level of unemployment. Where things might be, I think, slightly worse than that is because of the sectors that are hard hit, big employers in hospitality, long time before that gets back to normal. So even when much of the economy is back to normal, hospitality might not be. That, I think, is a problem. The minimum wage I referred to earlier on, if the government pushes through with those plans, that's going to make things, I think, a lot worse. And then there's the background stuff that I referred to about robots and AI. And I don't think it's not immediate or big, but one of the reasons why I've been comparatively optimistic about the economic impact of robots and AI is that I've said, including in articles in the Telegraph and elsewhere, that however capable robots become, there's one thing that they're never going to be any better at than human beings, and that is being human. And my contention has been that business about humanity is extremely important, that in all our business dealings and in our leisure time, we would have a very strong preference for dealing with other human beings. Now, what worries me particularly about this is, and I didn't think about that when I wrote my book, unfortunately, that we may have a phenomenon here where we'll have exactly the opposite preference. That because of the continuing risk of infection, and it goes back to what I said earlier on about, depends whether we sort of put an end to all this permanently or not. I think we may get to a point, a state of mind, where more and more people think, well, we just want to minimize contact with strangers. Now, if that's true, then the medium and long-term impact for unemployment is a lot worse than what I indicated earlier on.
And question from Dave Covell.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the presentation, Roger. Much appreciated, very clearly articulated. I thought the point you made around spending restrictions was quite interesting. And my question is, given the recent period, the so-called end of austerity, how likely is it that the government will find that a politically acceptable course of action?
Well, it's a good point you raise. I mean, one understands from my own contacts and also reading the newspapers that there's considerable cabinet opposition to renewed austerity, and you can see why. And they talk about, this is not a government, the Johnson government is not at all like the previous Conservative governments under Cameron. It ain't going to be like that again, they say. Well, that's all very well, but then what is it going to be like? I mean, these people are just going to have to face economic reality. I've told you what the options are. There's no easy, well, the easiest option, the one that I would want to go for, even that, is not totally without costs or pain. That's to say, you try to grow your way out of it. You tolerate it, you suppress the financial sector a bit, keep real interest rates low. But even then, you see, I would tame ambitions for spending increases. And whether this is possible, whether it's viable, depends on the details of the arithmetic. We're not going to be in a position, I think, to be able to afford to increase government spending at the same rate of GDP. So in a sense, there's got to be a sort of austerity, I think. It doesn't necessarily involve swinging cuts, but I think it does involve government spending growing less than GDP overall. Now, if that's not what the government's going to do because it finds it politically unpalatable, what is it going to do? Is it going to raise taxes dramatically? Some people talk about that. Some people talk about it as being inevitable. The IFS often says this is now inevitable that taxes are going to go up. I think it's not a word I like. I don't think it's inevitable, but I could see some governments will go down this line. They even talk of special taxes on the wealthy. Countries that have got wealth taxes, they're increasing them. Countries that haven't got wealth taxes, bringing them in. I think this is completely the wrong thing to do, and certainly increasing marginal tax rates on income would be bonkers. So supposing it doesn't do that, then what is it going to do? Is it going to default? Is it going to continue increasing, financing the deficit with money creation ad infinitum? Does it think it can get away without that causing inflation? If so, it's can have that one with me. Or is it going to willingly embrace inflation? So I think the substance of your question is right. There's going to be considerable political opposition, and rightly and understandably so, to anything that smacks of austerity again. But then the question is, then what are they going to do about it? They've got to have an answer. And I've already come up with what I think is the most plausible and least painful.
Very clear. Thanks, Roger.
And Melissa, you've been scrutinising the chat as it's been coming in. Who wants to ask a question? You're muted.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I had a question earlier on from James Hartley from Swiss Re. James, are you still on the call?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. So I had a couple of questions actually. One is around the impact of this V-shaped dip, Roger, that you were talking about, and some analysis suggests that could be as high as $8 trillion, the output of China. So the first question is, how will the economy cope with something of that order of magnitude? And then the second question was around debt, again in terms of quantum, that if we look at the interventions so far are between 11 and 12 trillion dollars, and that's before we even start accounting for unemployment costs. How can the economy recover from that degree of debt?
Yes. Well, on the first question about how can we cope with that degree of loss of output, well, we're just permanently poorer as a result. We've already lost a considerable amount of output and consumption, and a lot of that will never come back. I mean, it's worth thinking about those shapes that I drew. And by the way, don't get too bound up with the precise shape. I've drawn it as a V, not to say it's not going to be, a U or a W or whatever. I just did that for illustrative purposes. The one, you can get too pessimistic, and I suppose I'm a sort of a comparative optimist about all this compared to some of the ultra pessimists out there. There are some features of all this that ought to make one comparatively optimistic. And first of all, there's been virtually no destruction of capital. Now this contrasts completely, real capital, with a war. When you think about the Second World War and what it did, destroying homes, factories, buildings, infrastructure, to a lesser extent that was true in the First World War as well. Moreover, there's been very little destruction of human capital either. We know that the death toll is quite high, pushing up to 100,000 in the States and so on and so forth. But these are mainly older people. I don't want to sound narrowly economical about this, but the loss of these people as far as productive power is not going to be that great. So the loss of supply capacity is actually going to be comparatively low because of all that. There's a loss of, if you like, organizational capital, because when companies go bust, even though the physical capital is still there and the human capital is somewhere in the system, bringing that all together again in a way that can make successful, profitable and productive businesses is not easy. It just doesn't happen overnight. But that, I think, should make one makes me anyway, comparatively optimistic. It is not the same as an earthquake or a tsunami or a nuclear explosion or a war. The the economic loss comes from the lockdown. And when the lockdown eases, we'll get back to something like normal. So I'm quite optimistic that we can cope with that degree of lost production. We will have coped with it already. We're already undergoing it. All of us, you know, the loss of holidays, restaurant meals, all those. Don't forget so much of the economy is about the service sector. I don't know about you lot. I've suffered an enormous amount. I mean, I would have been abroad umpteen times by now. I'd have been at my house in the south of France, and I love going out for restaurant meals. I've been to cinema and theatre and concerts, of which I've been locked up here. So I've already suffered a massive loss. I'm sure most of people in this country that's true of in some sense or other. The second question about debt. Yeah, these are enormous numbers, but you know, I hope my historical chart, was useful as a way of thinking about these things. A lot of people just don't know the history. That chart going back to 1700. The numbers are huge, but this is no worse, but is nowhere near the situation we were in the Second World War, when we were borrowing enormous amounts in order to pay for the war, and we were left with enormous amounts of debt. And I don't think, unless this goes on for years, I don't think our debt will get anything like it. I mean, I don't know what the number precisely no one does, but 120, 130, 140 is not inconceivable. At that sort of level, we're nowhere near even where we got to after the Napoleonic Wars, never mind where we got to at the end of the Second World War. And with regard to the Second World War, let's not forget what that period was. So here we are, we emerge. Imagine what the policymakers must have thought. 259% was the ratio of public debt to GDP at the end of the Second World War. And what was the economic reality over the next 30 years, 1945 to 1975? Was it, you know, being ground down by having to repay this debt? No. It was the fastest period of economic growth sustained over 30 years in the whole of our history. And not just general economic growth, the fastest increase in living standards. During that period, that's when Macmillan, the Prime Minister, told the British people, "You've never had it so good." It was during the period when we were getting debt down from 259% of GDP. So this notion that, you know, this is bound to impoverish us all forever is, I think, complete bunkum. It isn't. It takes some managing, not going to be easy, but it could be consistent with continued rapid improvement in living standards and GDP.
Very interesting. Thanks, Roger.
We also we have a couple of people interested on the chat. You mentioned earlier about the political isolation of China, and I'd be interested to hear a few more thoughts about you know, how you see the US's relationship with China, and also what you think the effect on the UK relationship with China will be, considering how reliant we are on it today.
Yeah. Excellent questions, all of them. Well, this relationship between the US and China, and indeed the West in general and China, was under threat and be subject to change long before the virus. I mean, essentially the story, I think, we need to go back a bit. When under Deng Xiaoping, China started to relax, to liberalize, 1978-9, the general assumption, the West, I think, was that China would move progressively towards an open Western model in all sorts of ways. Okay, they were still the Communist Party and they were keeping strong central control. They were doing the economy first, bit by bit, but that was the right way to do things, complete contrast to Russia, which was a total mess of things. Eventually, as China became richer and richer, markets became liberalized, China would liberalize politically, and what's more, all this would happen better and stronger and sooner the more we engage with China, brought them into the world, and in 20 or 30 years' time, China would be a normal country, and hey presto, everything would be fine. And that was, broadly speaking, the view under President Clinton, which is why, of course, China was brought into the WTO, and it was welcomed in and so on and so forth. Things took a different turn under President Xi, who has become more authoritarian. Don't forget, he's basically declared himself emperor for life, not called emperor, of course, but he's there for life. He's given a distinct preference for the party and the central government over further liberalization. And the Chinese government has behaved in a number of ways pretty dreadfully, really. So there's been a real challenge to the West before this happened. And the result was the West had a real choice, I think. You know, was it for the sake of doing business, if you like, pure economics, just going to tolerate all this and not worry about it that much? Or was China becoming a sort of enemy? And America was clearly going in the direction of the second proposition. Now, the British government, particularly under Cameron and Osborne, sort of thought it could finesse this and remain friends with the United States and yet at the same time suck up to China and do lots of business with China. I think it was actually pretty naive about that. And I suspect we're going to see a reset in Sino-British relations. I don't think we've got much of an alternative but to go along with America on this. Now, maybe we're going to try and soften some of the edges of President Trump's extremism, but I suspect we'll land up by siding quite closely with the United States. So I think links between Britain and China, they're going to be in some considerable difficulty. But I don't think we're going to be unusual in that regard. I mean, there is going to be an investigation of how this ghastly pandemic began. And even if, you know, President Trump is being wild and irresponsible in suggesting it came out of a laboratory, whether deliberately or not, the fact of the matter is that the Chinese government didn't behave well with regard to admitting the scale of the problem. It suppressed people who were trying to bring attention to the problem. It shows all the worst aspects of authoritarianism. And across the world, I think governments are going to look at China differently. I mean, you could get very bearish indeed about this, and there's an article in today's FT, a great leading article by Gideon Rachman talking about this. I mean, it's not impossible to imagine this deteriorating into something like the Cold War, or indeed he speculates the hot war, a hot war. I think this is a very dangerous aspect of the whole problem.
Thank you. Is it realistic, therefore, to assume that we can bring manufacturing back to the UK?
Well, not completely, no. But there were hopes that something of this would be happening anyway. I mean, let's take a business like cars, for instance. I mean, it's an industry which is under massive threat anyway, we know. But the model recently was very much to have distributed supply chains, not just across Europe, but across the world, just-in-time manufacturing, so on and so forth. So even though Britain had a substantial car manufacturing business and a substantial business manufacturing parts too, there was not, I think, a widespread appreciation of the vulnerability of that model. Now, and we don't know, of course, quite how much car manufacturing is going to survive in this country, I think what we're going to see is more attention paid to making more parts in that supply chain in the United Kingdom. And I think that tendency will be there across a whole series of activities. Now, manufacturing, though, counts for only about 9%, believe it or not, of the UK economy now. So it's important, but it's not overwhelmingly important. The city, thinking of financial services broadly defined, we can never get completely accurate or incontrovertible numbers on this, is probably around about 7 or 8% of GDP. So probably as important, just about, as manufacturing.
Roger, I think your time is up, and that was absolutely brilliant. Some wonderful comments, great summary, clear and well-articulated presentation, excellent presentation. So people have been very impressed by what you said. I thought it was very clear. I thought it was interesting, practical, and thoughtful. And I think it's done exactly what we wanted it to do. First-class presentation with lots of great content. And I think the only thing to say in relation to that is, you mentioned AI out of your presentation. Do you know an excellent book on AI that anybody's written?
Yeah, of course, by me. The AI Economy. But
is it worth getting?
It's certainly worth getting. What I should stress, though, it is not so much, and I'm not a techie, as you and your staff might have had ample demonstration of this morning, as I wrestled with the technology, which so far seems to have worked. So the book is about the economic impact of robots and AI. And it's trying to respond to the question, should we all be worried about this? Is it going to impoverish us? What should we do about it? It's about the impacts on business. It's stuff about driverless cars also, but stuff about levels of employment, levels of leisure, things I was talking about earlier on. That's to say, are we going to end up working a bit less? And I think the answer is yes, we are.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that. An outstanding presentation. We will be sending the notes and the slides and the recording out within a very short period of time. So thanks to you and thanks to our participants.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.